that includes both the people there, thinking about the ravages of King Leopold, for example, or the deaths in India in the 19th century due to famine, and the natural resources that were stripped from those areas and moved to other places to feed the factories of the developed world. The profit motive, and here we're thinking about principally Marx, but also Weber, is inherently unlimited. It knows no bounds in and of itself. The surpluses that capitalism produces can be amassed and hoarded. They can be moved away from certain places. They can collect in others, and then they need to find some place to go. This process of accumulation continues. It expands outward. The markets that it creates can outstrip the limits of local ecologies, local ecosystems, local societies. Generally speaking, when a subsistence economy collapses, for whatever set of reasons, people become dependent on exchange in the market. And if you've done the reading for Thursday, the last 5 pages of Bernstein, that's very much what he's talking about. You look at how capitalist social relations articulated with the social and economic relations that they encountered when they got to Asia, Africa, Latin America, North America. Generally speaking, the people who were there did not enthusiastically change overnight into wage laborers. Generally speaking, they had previously been in some way or another closely connected to subsistence production, production for use rather than for exchange. And they typically held on to those ways of producing their own livelihoods as long as they could. And I mean, we're accustomed to not producing our own food. We think it makes perfect sense to go look for a job and sell our wages, sell our labor for wages, for a salary. We are dependent on exchange in the market for the things we need. But other people in other places are still struggling with this. And the coffee farmers in Ethiopia in the movie are a good example. Creditor-debtor relations often trigger this. The Bernstein analysis, or the concepts Bernstein introduces to think about how labor changed in different places over time. Becoming indebted, or in other ways needing to have cash to pay taxes, for example, tends in different places at different times in different intensities. Nonetheless, the pattern is one in which this tends to drive people into market relations in pursuit of cash to pay off their debts or to pay their taxes. So, the conclusions for that lecture. Colonialism was integrally related to emerging industrialism. And again, you can draw on Bernstein to clarify that and give you tools to think about it. It left behind legacies of resource depletion and primitive accumulation. And at the global scale today, uneven development is more about contending with these legacies than about so-called natural distributions of resources independent of these processes. Are there questions? So, George Orwell. What do you know about George Orwell? Have you read this essay before? No? None of you have ever been asked to read this essay before? Wow, times have changed. For many years, this essay was upheld by many, many college instructors of writing, of composition, as one of the finest essays ever written in the English language. Obviously, that's no longer the case. Orwell's scholarship has fallen victim to a certain amount of, well, we won't go into it yet right now. What else did he write? Animal Farm, 1984. He's famous for other things. He wrote, he had a fascinating life, actually. Let's start just by talking about Burma for a moment. This is where the essay takes place. The military junta in charge of Burma would ask that we call it Myanmar instead. But the international community, for the most part, has not yet granted that. So you'll see both names. Frequently you'll see it called Burma, and they might make mention of the fact that you're supposed to think of it as Myanmar, but most of the world still thinks of it as Burma. And to some degree this is because the military junta in charge of Burma is about as renegade a state as there is in the world right now. I mean, maybe North Korea compares. But the Burmese junta is about as secretive, unaccountable, and despicable as any state in the world. It has very little legitimacy in the eyes of its own people or in the eyes of the rest of the world. I put this together a couple years ago just to give you perspective. If you translate these basic characteristic features of Burma into California equivalents so that you can get some perspective on it. The population is about the same, slightly larger than California's, but the GDP is 1/20th the size of California's. In area, it's nearly twice as big, but in GDP per capita, it is 1/25th what California's is, and in GDP per square kilometer, it is 4/1000th or 1/250th of California. This is a place of extraordinary poverty and underdevelopment. It's not a place you want to live. I think we should all thank our lucky stars that we don't live there. This is an old map. This is Moulmein, where the story in the essay takes place. What do you notice about this? What is this landform? What's that? A what? No, it's a peninsula, but what else do you notice about it? It's a delta. It's an enormous delta. All this land is basically sediment that's come down from the interior of Asia, the Himalayan plateau, over thousands and thousands and thousands of years and settled from basically out of the rivers and built up over time. The entire thing sits basically at sea level. This is what it looks like. This is during floods. The floods are a fairly regular event. You see lots and lots of farm fields, and when it floods, it really floods. You get enormous displacement. This is an area of the world that is, after a handful of islands, this is probably the area of the world that is most at risk of sea level rise from global warming, because the entire place is just about sitting at sea level to begin with. Not the entire place, but a large, large portion of it. These are satellite photos taken 20 days apart in 2006. This is before a flood, and this is during a flood, and you can see how much land is inundated during a flood. This is also where, how many of you remember this? Just a couple years ago. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What happened? There were protests, widespread protests led by these monks. Orwell mentions these monks in the first paragraph. Not the very same monks, but different generation, otherwise similar. Anybody know anything about these monks? Orwell remarks that these monks tend to stand around as if they have nothing to do. And he finds this extremely annoying because they spend their time in subtle ways making fun of him. And he doesn't care for that. It's an interesting thing. In this part of the world, it's accepted and normal for men to become monks temporarily for a period of time when they're young adults. So they don't necessarily have to commit themselves to a life of being a monk, but they can play this role for a period of time. This creates a large number of young men who, if they choose, can mount a kind of rebellion. And because they're monks with a certain religious authority, it looks really bad if you're the government to shoot a bunch of monks, right? If they're protesting peacefully, blowing away a bunch of monks is different from blowing away a bunch of, say, factory workers, right? There's a moral authority among the population for these monks. Well, it didn't stop the junta, and in fact, they were suppressed with the military and shot down, and the junta continues to rule. They've actually moved the capital to a remote location in the jungle, like literally relocated the entire capital as if to just escape from their own people. All right, let's take a short break. If you haven't read Orwell yet, and you have it with you, I would suggest that you read it now. It's not very long. You can probably get most of the way through it in the 5 minutes of break. All right, if you need a copy, you haven't read it, maybe your neighbor has a copy that you could borrow, and I'd like you to at least get started reading it. Okay. So I want to start with just a few remarks about the Delany chapter. Chapter 2 of Delany. You don't have to put Orwell away. You don't have to pull out Delany. I just want to ask him, what are the general conclusions that Delany reaches in that chapter? He reviews the uses of territory in different disciplines: international relations, sociology, psychology, anthropology. What does he conclude from this brief survey? He suggests that each of these disciplines has taken up the subject of territory, perhaps specifically in recent years or recent decades. But he suggests that territory has, in a sense, been disciplined by these disciplines. It's been territorialized itself. And he says each discipline seems to have its own sense of what territory is, and that sense of territory is specific to the kinds of interests and concerns and questions that that discipline has, but that it essentially defines territory at the scales that are relevant to its disciplinary pursuit and doesn't really problematize it at other scales. So international relations has its sense of what territory means that's very much caught up with sovereignty and notions of the state, the law, that kind of thing, but it doesn't really do very much with territory at other scales, at subnational scales, for example. International relations becomes a discipline about the geopolitics between nation states, with each nation state's territory sort of already defined, or if it has been violated, that becomes what international relations are about, right? It's about asserting certain territorial claims to sovereignty and then working out disputes if those claims are in any way violated or infringed upon. And he works through anthropology and sociology, and in those disciplines, the scale of territory is smaller. You get down to anthropology, and you're looking at territoriality in terms of cultural groups or entities, peoples that seem to inhabit some kind of space that might not be bounded as clearly as a nation state, but the discipline itself needs there to be some kind of boundedness to its objects, right? You can't study a culture unless you can more or less define where that culture is. And that's a kind of territory that's very different from the territory of international relations. And it contains a lot of problems, actually. This is a problem that anthropologists ran into in parts of West Africa in the 30s and 40s. They could find clans and lineages and study them, but they started to realize that the boundaries between clans and lineages were so fluid and so difficult to pin down that everything they had to say about a given cultural group or clan or kinship structure essentially fell apart if you changed the scale at which you were evaluating things. And he goes on to psychology. So the territory of an individual and the space that individual sort of claims as his or her own and feels comfortable within, that's another kind of territory. And Delaney's point at the end, and this is why I asked you to read this chapter, it's not so much that I'm asking you to memorize these different disciplines' definitions of territory. The point at the end is precisely that they are thinking, at each discipline has different scales, but they're still basically thinking, he says, horizontally, two-dimensionally about territory. It's as though it's all about a map, a two-dimensional map, and you can bound these different entities, whether it's an individual or a family or a village or a city or a nation. You can bound them and draw lines on the map, and that becomes the sort of territorial point or frame of reference that matters for that discipline. But he's interested in asking how these things interrelate with each other vertically, right? So how does the boundary of two counties interact with Stanford University to create a kind of unevenness that is not simply the result of one scale of processes or activities? So the reason I'm carrying on about this is that I want you to read Orwell in that light. I want to suggest that the reason this essay is useful for us is that it gives us a way of sort of reading down through these scales from colonialism and imperialism as this grand global chess game all the way down to the micro-politics of an instantaneous couple of hours for a police sub-inspector working for the British Colonial Civil Service in Burma in the 1920s. He says, "One day something happened which in a roundabout way was enlightening. It was a tiny incident in itself, but it gave me a better glimpse than I had had before of the real nature of imperialism, the real motives for which despotic governments act." What does he mean? What's the story? He's suggesting that he got an insight into the nature of imperialism one day. Why? What did he do? What happened? Do I have to read the whole thing out loud to you? I'd rather not. We don't have much time. Yes? Okay. He's called as the policeman because there's an elephant that has broken its chain. It's what is must? Anybody know what's going on with this elephant? It's a hormonal thing, folks. This elephant's going through that time when it's got something on its mind and it's not going to pay much attention to anybody except perhaps its master. It's the one person who can get it under control. It's very dangerous. Is the elephant still dangerous when he sees it? No. This period of hormonal excitement has passed, and the elephant is now calmed down and is standing in a field eating. But Orwell, at this point, is what? He's got an elephant gun in his hand, and he's got thousands of people behind him who have followed him. This is the most exciting thing that's happened in weeks, right? And what's the difference between him and them? Besides the fact that he's got the elephant gun. What are some of the differences between him and them? Yeah. He's British. He's white. He's the police sub-inspector. He's the cop. He's the constituted authority of the area. Technically, he's in charge, right? He can do whatever he wants. He says he doesn't want to shoot the elephant. But if he doesn't shoot the elephant, what's going to happen? He has got to shoot the elephant. That's what he says, right? What's he afraid of? Why does he feel this compulsion? Yeah. Okay. He's worried that if he doesn't shoot the elephant, you put it well, it will undermine his authority as the policeman, as the face and body of British authority. Although for himself, personally, the thing he's most worried about is that he will be laughed at. He's intensely aware of this, right? He's filled with a kind of low-level rage towards imperialism itself, which he says he's already decided he dislikes. It's despicable. But he hasn't got any perspective on it. He's a young man at this point. He grew up in England. He was not from a privileged class, although he was educated at a very privileged school.